In the flickering candlelight, their faces stared back at him. Silent and cold, he kissed their lips, though the blood hadn't dried yet. These weren't portraits or wax figures, they were real. It's the documented behavior of one of the most powerful noblemen in 15th century France. A war hero who fought beside Joan of Arc, and who may have been one of history's first serial killers. His name was Gilles de Rais, but history has forgotten him. Or maybe it chose to forget. In the age of knights, castles, and holy wars, de Rais wasn't some lurking monster in the woods. He was a decorated commander, a millionaire aristocrat, and a celebrated patron of the arts. His castles stretched across the French countryside. His legacy was built in blood and honor, or so it seemed. But over the course of 8 years, children began vanishing near his estates. Poor boys sent to beg at castle gates never returned home. A merchant's son delivering goods disappeared. The rumors started quietly, then grew louder. And soon, whispers of missing children turned into accusations of something far worse. What made this case so terrifying wasn't just the body count. It was the method, the access, and above all, the impunity. Because while the mutilated corpses of children were allegedly being dumped into rivers or burned in castle ovens, no one dared accuse the Marshal of France, not until it was too late. Before we dive into the horrific details of what happened behind those stone walls, let's rewind. Because this nightmare didn't begin with murder. It began with a boy born into unimaginable power and taught that the world was his to take. In 1404, in northwestern France, a child named Gilles de Montmorency-Laval was born into a world of impossible privilege. His family owned more land than some small kingdoms. Their coat of arms flew over dozens of fortresses. But privilege in this case didn't guarantee peace. By age 11, Gilles had likely witnessed his father's death, torn apart by a wild boar during a hunting trip. His mother died soon after. Orphaned and vulnerable, he fell into the care of his maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon, a man described by contemporaries as manipulative, ambitious, and cold. And it was under Jean's guidance that Gilles began to transform. He was given the best education of his time: Latin, theology, military science. He was brilliant, fluent, charismatic. But Jean taught him something else too. That power meant entitlement. That violence wasn't a crime, but a right. That rules were for the weak. By the time he was 16, Gilles was already known for his erratic temper. He could host a feast one moment and strike a servant the next. But in a society ruled by force, these were seen as signs of strength, not warning flags. Then came the war, and with it, glory. France was losing the 100 Years' War. The English controlled vast territories. Morale was crumbling. Then, in 1429, a teenage peasant girl appeared at court, claiming to be sent by God to deliver France. Her name was Jeanne la Pucelle, or, as history remembers her, Joan of Arc. While most nobles laughed at her claims, Gilles did not. He was assigned as one of her protectors, and their partnership would change the course of the war. At Orléans, their combined forces broke a 6-month siege in just 4 days. 4 days. The impossible became real. Town after town fell under their command. Gilles became a national hero, known for charging headfirst into battle and never retreating. At 25, he was made Marshal of France, one of the kingdom's highest honors. But something else was happening, something darker. The brutality of war, the screams, the blood, the endless slaughter didn't repulse Gilles. It fascinated him. And when Joan was captured by the English in 1430 and burned at the stake in 1431, Gilles didn't raise a finger to save her. He simply retired. He withdrew from war, from politics, from the spotlight. And that's when the disappearances began. Gilles de Rais didn't fade quietly into retirement. He vanished from the battlefield and re-emerged in his castles as something else entirely. What followed was a descent into extravagance that stunned even France's notoriously decadent nobility. He spent like a man trying to outrun something. His private guard swelled to 200 men, each dressed in tailored silks. He threw feasts for thousands, built lavish pageants reenacting his battlefield glory, and gave away wine and gold like a king. But no display was more disturbing than the chapel he built in 1433. He called it the Chapel of the Holy Innocents, named for the children massacred by King Herod in the Gospel of Matthew. It was staffed by a choir of carefully selected young boys, not for their piety, for their beauty. To the outside world, this was the act of a devout nobleman. But history would come to see it as something else, a grotesque altar to innocence, and a stage for horrors yet to come. As his fortune dwindled, Gilles began selling off his lands, entire castles, gone in exchange for gold and indulgence. His family, horrified, pleaded with the king to block any further transactions. An official edict was issued forbidding the sale of his property. But Gilles, ever resourceful, found loopholes. His need for wealth, or what that wealth allowed him to do, wouldn't be denied. And while the money slipped through his fingers, something far worse was happening behind stone walls. The first rumors began around 1432. In villages near his castles, Tiffauges, Machecoul, Champtocé, parents whispered that children sent to the gates begging for bread never returned. At first it was easy to explain. Noble households often absorbed young boys as pages or servants. A child might vanish into a kitchen or stables and simply never be seen again. Life was brutal, records were scarce, but the numbers kept growing. It wasn't just peasant children. A blacksmith's apprentice, a merchant's son, a cousin of Gilles's own steward. Always the same story. The child went to one of Gilles's castles and disappeared. Sometimes they were recruited directly by Gilles's men, promised work or food. Sometimes they were invited inside the castle with warm smiles and open gates. And then, nothing. No word, no body, no justice. But perhaps the most chilling detail is this. People knew. Locals later testified to seeing Gilles' servants dispose of small bodies in the middle of the night. One witness described carts of bundled shapes being dragged from the castle and burned. In 1437, a group of townspeople reported seeing charred remains, unmistakably human, being removed from the grounds. Yet no one dared accuse him. He was still the Marshal of France, still a noble, still untouchable. But in the shadows, the stories grew darker. Children weren't just vanishing. Some said they were being used, sacrificed, destroyed. And when Gilles finally confessed, the truth, if it was truth, made every rumor seem like a mercy. By the late 1430s, Gilles de Rais was desperate. His fortune had all but vanished. The castles that once defined his power were either sold or falling into disrepair. His family had turned against him. Even the king had publicly moved to stop his financial spiral. But Gilles had one more option, and it wasn't one he learned in war. He turned to alchemy and to the occult. Obsessed with restoring his wealth, Gilles surrounded himself with men who claimed they could summon demons. Chief among them was a shadowy Italian priest named Francesco Prelati, a self-styled magician who promised access to the demon baron, keeper of hidden treasures. Prelati's price? A ritual, one that required specific ingredients: the hand, the heart, the eyes, and the blood of a child. Gilles agreed. It's here that the story shifts from monstrous to unthinkable. Because if the testimonies of the time are to be believed, the murders that had started as indulgence now had a new purpose: sacrifice. And then came the confessions. In September 1440, Gilles was finally arrested, but not for murder. The catalyst was something far more reckless. In a petty land dispute with a local cleric, Gilles kidnapped a priest during Mass, at sword point in front of witnesses. That act, a direct assault on the church, gave local authorities the excuse they needed. Armed men surrounded his castle. Gilles, bizarrely, surrendered without resistance. He was charged with heresy and blasphemy. But once inside the courtroom, the floodgates opened. Multiple trials were held, one secular, one ecclesiastical. Witnesses came forward. Servants confessed. And finally, so did Gilles. At first, he denied everything. He mocked the judges. He refused to acknowledge the court's legitimacy. But then came the threat of torture and the threat of excommunication, the spiritual death he feared most. That broke him. On October 20th, 1440, Gilles made a full confession. What he described was worse than anything imagined. Children, mostly boys between 6 and 14, were lured into his castles. They were promised food, warmth, sometimes jobs. Once inside, they were taken to a hidden chamber. Gilles would speak kindly, calm their fear. Sometimes he cried with them. Then the killing began. He described hanging children from hooks until they lost consciousness, then reviving them, telling them it was all a game, then killing them slowly. Sometimes he used a special blade, la braire, to decapitate them while still alive. Sometimes he broke their necks. Other times he simply watched them bleed out. And after death, he continued. He opened their bodies to admire their insides. He kissed their lips. He kept their heads, the most beautiful ones, arranging them like art on his mantle. When the smell grew too strong, he burned them, and then searched for replacements. He claimed he'd lost count of how many children he killed. The court estimated 140. Some historians suggest up to 800. And through it all, he remained calm, logical, articulate. "I knew it was wrong," he told the court, "but I did it anyway." The courtroom was packed. Nobles, clergy, townspeople all came to witness the unraveling of a man once hailed as a national hero. But what they heard defied comprehension. Gilles de Rais confessed, in excruciating detail. He described his methods, named his victims, quoted prayers to demons, and most disturbingly, he did it without hysteria. There was no sign of madness, no delusion, just clarity, almost pride. His accomplices, too, gave matching statements. Henriette and Poitou, his closest servants, described how they helped procure children, clean the blood, dispose of the bodies. The stories aligned in chilling precision. No contradictions, no gaps. And yet, no physical evidence. No bodies were discovered in his castles during the arrest. No bones, no mass graves. Only testimonies and memories. Still, the court didn't hesitate. On October 23rd, 1440, Gilles was found guilty by both the secular court and the church. The charges: heresy, sodomy, child murder. The sentence: death by hanging and burning. But even here, the church showed him mercy. Gilles requested to be absolved, to die as a Christian. The request was granted. He would be given last rites and buried in sacred ground, a privilege his servants would not receive. On October 26, 1440, the people of Nantes gathered in the fields outside the city. The morning was grey. A scaffold had been built beside a large pyre. The 3 condemned men stood before it, dressed in white, the color of repentance. Gilles addressed the crowd. Calm, composed, he asked parents to raise their children strictly, blaming his crimes on the unchecked indulgence of his own childhood. He embraced Henriette and Poitou, thanking them, asking them to die bravely. Then he stepped forward to be hanged first, As he had requested, the rope tightened, his body fell. A moment later, flames roared beneath. But as promised, his corpse was cut down before the fire could consume it entirely. He was taken to the monastery of Notre-Dame-des-Carmes and buried. His name was stained, but his soul, in the eyes of the church, redeemed. His servants burned to ash. The crowd dispersed slowly. Some wept, others cheered. Many simply stared, hollow-eyed, trying to process what they had just witnessed. But the story wasn't over. In the centuries that followed, the case of Gilles de Rais refused to rest. And not because of the horrors, but because of the questions. Why were there no physical remains ever found? Why did the confession come only under threat of torture and spiritual damnation? Who benefited from his death? The Duke of Brittany, who led the prosecution, inherited all of Gilles' confiscated lands. The Bishop of Nantes gained immense political power, and the French crown eliminated a nobleman who had become reckless, unstable, and embarrassingly visible. In 1992, over 550 years later, a group of scholars, judges, and historians conducted a symbolic retrial. They reviewed the evidence with modern legal standards. The outcome? Not guilty. They cited unreliable testimony, political motivations, the absence of physical proof, and the high likelihood of forced confessions. Some now believe Gilles de Rais wasn't a monster, but a victim, and yet others say, how could so many servants lie? How could so many grieving families be mistaken? The flames that consumed Gilles de Rais in October 1440 didn't just destroy a man. They destroyed records, silenced witnesses, and buried truth under centuries of dust, fear, and folklore. What remains today is a riddle. Was he one of history's most prolific child killers, or the perfect scapegoat? If you believe the confession, Gilles was a predator beyond imagination, a nobleman who raped, tortured, and butchered children, all while cloaked in silk and divine authority. A man who turned castles into slaughterhouses, who kissed the lips of corpses, who offered flesh to demons. But if you believe his defenders, a different story emerges. They argue he was a threat to powerful men, that his wealth, eccentric behavior, and loyalty to Joan of Arc, a figure many in the church viewed as heretical, made him dangerous. They say he was framed, his confession coerced, his trial a formality, and history offers precedent. In medieval Europe, accusations of witchcraft, heresy, and child murder were often used to eliminate rivals. Demonology was a legal tool, not a supernatural concern. One whispered allegation could snowball into mass hysteria. So which version is true? The answer may never be known. What we do know is this: Gilles de Rais, whether murderer or martyr, was a product of his time. A time when wealth could shield evil, when children could vanish without consequence, when justice was shaped not by truth but by politics. His case became the prototype for later tales, inspiring the legend of Bluebeard, the nobleman who lured wives into his castle and killed them one by one. The myth grew legs, walked through centuries, and returned to us again and again in new faces, new names. Jack the Ripper, H. Holmes, Jeffrey Dahmer. The pattern is old, and maybe that's the real horror. That the face of the monster doesn't change, that it's not just medieval, that sometimes the most terrifying people in history weren't hiding in shadows. They were celebrated, decorated, powerful. They built chapels, commanded armies, hosted banquets, and behind locked doors, they collected heads.